Hello, good evening and welcome. Hello, welcome everyone. This is I wasn't at the first one, I'm afraid, but this is the second T&M event. And T&M, I'm told, this stands for Talk and Music. So it's a talk and music event, and this is the second one we've had. So welcome everyone. Just to introduce you, on T&M, I'm just reading this, we would like to combine short sets of inspirational music with influential and relevant talks on science, humanity, economics and personal growth, always with a Christian ethos or Christian faith elements present. So tonight we've got Heaven's Roar, which is the band opening, and then straight after we've got the pleasure to welcome Gavin Cox over there in the corner, and Jonathan from Creation Ministries International to present a talk on creation or evolution. And so welcome to Gavin, who's come all the way from Leicester. At the end of the evening, we'll have around 15 minutes to have question and answer session. There'll be a mic passed round, so we'll do that at the end of the evening. I've got a note here to do fire and safety. If there's a fire, go out that way unless the fire's there, and then we'll show you out that way. And toilets are in the front foyer round there, and there is another toilet unless there's a fire. In which case, use the toilets down there, round to the left. So there's two ladies and gents there, or down to the left there. I think that's it. I'm going to say welcome to Heaven's Roar Band, and we'll go from there.
Don't forget my name. If you can hold the stars fear? What do I have to fear? Your love has called my name. What do I have to fear? What do I have to fear? If you can hold the stars in place, you can hold my heart the same. Whenever I fall away, whenever I start to break, so here I am lifting up my heart. If you can calm the raging sea, you can calm the storm in me. You're never too far away, you never show up too late. So here I am lifting up my heart to the one who holds the stars. most beautiful story creation's ever heard. Your love and your power covering the earth. We wonder with you, Father, the Spirit and the Son, singing your glory. May your kingdom come. The most beautiful story creation's ever heard. Your love and your power covering the earth. We wonder with you, Father, the Spirit and the Son, singing your glory. May your kingdom come. May your kingdom come. May your kingdom
He is Almighty God, Elohim, maker of the earth. He is the Lord of hosts, heaven's King, God of endless worth. His kingdom stands above every power, every living soul. His love is like the sun, ever true, shining over all. He is
Almighty God, Elohim, maker of the earth. He is the Lord of hosts, heaven's King, God of endless worth. His kingdom stands above every power, every living soul. His love is like the sun, ever true, shining over all. He is Almighty God, Elohim, maker of the earth. He is the Lord of hosts, heaven's King, God of endless worth. His kingdom stands above every power, every living soul. His love is like the sun, ever true, shining over all. He is Almighty God, Elohim, maker love is like the sun, ever true, shining over all.
trembles at his voice. How great is our God. Sing with me, how great is our God. And all will see how great is our God. Age to age
of the night.
Okay. So it's now time to welcome our speaker. I'm just going to say a little bit about, if that's okay, to say Creation Ministries is a non-profit creationist organisation of autonomous creationist apologetics ministries. Is that right? Sounds good, doesn't it? Ministries are located in Australia, Canada, New Zealand, South Africa, UK and US. And Gavin is a speaker for CMI and author of several technical publications, including The Hymn of Amos, An Ancient Flood Narrative, and Egypt's Hieroglyphics, A Cultural Memory of Creation and Noah's Flood. So welcome, Gavin. And
Well, thank you for coming tonight through the flood. I really admire you for coming out on a night like that. So it's great to be amongst a wonderful crowd of enthusiastic people. And I'm going to put your T in the T&M, although I thought the music is wonderful worship. Well, that's wonderful, led by our band there. Well, I've already been introduced, and this is my topic for tonight, Creational Evolution, Credible Answers for an Incredulous World. This talk is not going to be overly heavy on the science, so don't worry, but I want you to go away from tonight having come to an understanding of why creation and evolution is important to us as Christians. I want to connect it to the gospel. I want to connect it to your faith. I want to connect it to the real world. So this is the object of my talk tonight, is why is creation an important subject? It's not just a side issue. It's not just a red herring. It's actually a central gospel issue. So I hope by the end of the talk tonight, you'll actually see why it's a really central issue. But before I go on, I'd like to introduce you to something called InfoBytes. Now, InfoBytes is a free email newsletter that will come into your email box if you want to sign up. Comes once a few months, so not that regular. But we have all sorts of interesting articles. This one is, was Jesus just a man of his time? Because Jesus upheld Moses, who upheld 6-day creation, who upheld a literal Adam and an Eve. But if Jesus was wrong about something as basic as earth history, then how can he be the Son of God? If Jesus was wrong about the creation, when he is the creator, then surely we have a big problem here. So this is a very central issue. This is one particular issue that was written about. Are creationists at war with science? This was written by National Geographic, who claims that creationists are one of the groups at war with science. But of course, this is nonsense. If you know anything about the history of science, then all of the leading scientists of their time were Bible-believing Christians. They believed in a God who created an orderly universe that put laws into play in his universe. And because he's an immanent God, a God who wants to be known by his creation, then man can know how creation works. He said to Adam and Eve, go tend the garden, go be responsible for creation. And so if man is going to be responsible for creation, then he needs to know how it works. So obviously all the founders of science were not at war with science. They were believers in creation. Here's another one. Teaching creation is child abuse. That's what we've been leveled at us before. But I would say that teaching children that they're evolved apes, not responsible to a God, they can do their own thing, there's no absolute morality, I think that's a form of child abuse. Here's another one. Evolution turns pastors into atheists. It's actually true. I went to Bible college and I was taught theistic evolution. I didn't believe it, of course, because I already had a good foundation in my own upbringing and belief. But teaching pastors that they can believe in evolution has effects upon their own walk as Christians and upon their congregations. Now, if you'd like to sign up, Dominic's going to give some clipboards around and let those clipboards snake around. What we promise is that we do not sell your details on. We will not spam you. You will get this email into your inbox every few months, and there'll be some really fascinating articles. So if you want to have this free service, then please put your name down, and it's a great way to keep in contact with our ministry. And as we've already been introduced, we're thoroughly international. We run a mega website. Here we go. Oops, sorry. Just go backwards. There we go. It has a very powerful search engine. So if you want to actually do some research or have questions, you can go to creation.com. It's a very complicated web address, I know, creation.com, and just feed in some search terms and you can find out all sorts of answers. We've been going about 40 years as a ministry, and we have, probably as a Christian ministry, we have more PhD scientists working for us than any other Christian organization in the world. So whatever you have questions of, you can probably find the answers. Now, and just a little bit about me. Background in minerals engineering. I worked in the seismic industry looking for oil and gas all over the world. And when the price of oil crashed, I've gone into education. Got a bachelor's degree in theology, then did a master's degree in biblical studies, and then did another master's degree in Egyptology. So that's a little bit about me. So what's our topic tonight? I hope that my talk will be illuminating, and in fact, I hope the talk will make the lights come on for you in connecting creation to the gospel. As we shall see, it's not a side issue. Now, are we Christians here tonight? I hope so. And what is a Christian? Well, I would suggest that a Christian is someone who believes what Jesus believed, someone who follows the teachings of Jesus Christ, and that includes what he believed about creation. Now here's a verse in Mark 10, and here we have the genealogies. Oops. Sorry. Here we go. Right. No. I'm obviously a bit too keen with this clicker. Okay. So Jesus himself, when he began to teach, this is his genealogy. Now, many Christian leaders today are actually questioning the reality, the historical reality of people like Noah, people like Adam and Eve. But as we can see here, Jesus traces his genealogies right back to people like Adam, people like Noah. And if these people are mythical, as many Christian leaders and professors are saying, then surely we have a problem here. Both Jesus was mistaken about his genealogies, something as basic as his family tree, and Jesus is connected to a mythical figure like Adam. Surely if he's the Son of God, he cannot be mistaken about something as basic as his family tree. And in fact, to say that Jesus was mistaken would be to say that God allowed him to make errors. And if God allowed him to make errors, then we are charging God with lying. That's quite serious, isn't it? Here's another verse in Romans. It says, "Nevertheless, death reigned from Adam until Moses, even over them that had not sinned after the likeness of Adam's transgression, who is a figure of him that was to come. And if evolution is true, death was reigning long before Adam sinned. Have you thought about that? That has a profound consequence on the gospel. And also, if Adam was a mythical figure, then this verse is false. For how could death reign since a mythical figure? If evolution is true, death was already present in nature. Well, how about this verse? For as in Adam all die, so also in Christ shall all be made alive. So also it is written, the first man Adam became a living soul, the last Adam became a life-giving spirit. So Jesus is being called the last Adam here. So how can he be contrasted with a mythical figure? You see, if evolution is true, then there never could have been a first couple. There would have been isolated pockets of evolving hominids here and there throughout Africa. There never would have been a first couple called Adam and Eve. So how do you square this with the gospel? And in fact, church leaders who try to square this with the gospel, because they try and appease folks like Richard Dawkins, and it doesn't work, actually. So Richard Dawkins is an evolutionist and an Oxford University professor, and he's one of the most strident atheists around. And to try and impress Richard Dawkins with this kind of theology doesn't work. In fact, he said this in his program broadcast on Channel 4 in 2006, The Root of All Evil. And he talks about this idea of a symbolic Adam. And he said this, oh, but of course, the story of Adam and Eve was only ever symbolic, wasn't it? Symbolic. So Jesus had himself tortured and executed for a symbolic sin by a non-existent individual. Nobody not brought up in the faith could reach any verdict other than barking mad. And you know what? I think he's right. The gospel does not make sense unless Adam was a literal figure in a literal history that sinned and plunged the entire creation into death and decay. Creation is no side issue. So this is Moses again. And Jesus said, if you believe Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote of me. But if you believe not his writings, how shall you believe my words? And of course, Moses, he wrote about creation in 6 days. He wrote about Adam and Eve. He wrote about the flood. And Jesus would have upheld all of Moses' teachings. But if Moses was in error about earth history, then so is Jesus. And a mythical creation and flood account destroys the credibility of Jesus. So as you can see, this is no side issue. And Jesus actually used the flood to liken his second coming. He said, as it were the days of Noah, so shall be the coming of the Son of Man. You know, Jesus reckoned that the flood was global and that when he returns, every eye will see him. Again, judgment will be global. He treated the flood and Noah as a literal historical event. And that's why he could build theological truths about it. There's also the other New Testament writers, like Hebrews 11:7 and 1 Peter 3:19, 2 Peter 2:5. But then we have church leaders like Steve Chalk here. I don't know if you're aware, he's been doing a new reformation. He's been posting his 95 theses on YouTube, and he's actually rubbishing most of the Bible and saying that this is all historical nonsense. And he's been saying things like this. What about Noah and his ark? How did he collect all those animals from around the world? How did he get them all on board? How did he feed them once they were there? How did he stop them killing each other, or him and his wife and family in the process? Was the whole of humanity really rebuilt from Mr. and Mrs. Noah and their 3 sons and wives? The questions keep coming. And Steve Chalk's answer is to say that this is just based on a Babylonian myth. So when we have church leaders saying things like this, I think we have problems. You see, when the foundations of the Bible are given up for evolutionary belief, then man's opinion is placed over God's word. And as a result of this, what are the laws of God? If they're just opinions of men, we can have lawlessness. We can do what we like. Why not say marriage is whatever we want it to be? Do away with standards. Meaning of life? No, we're not made in the image of God anymore. Why not have abortion? These things, if we're not created in the image of God, why should we have standards? Why should we have ethics? Why should there be any absolute meaning to life? So I hope you're beginning to see that this whole creation evolution thing is actually very central. In fact, when our faith is built on Genesis, we have meaning to life. We have the knowledge that we are created in God's image. We are created by him and for him. We're in relationship to him. That gives life its ultimate meaning and purpose. But when we have that creation foundation, we can build things like the Christian worldview. It makes sense. But when Christians bring in evolution into that worldview, that connection there is going to be broken. It's going to be weakened dramatically. So what is the answer to the atheists? You know, if Christians are bringing on board the ideas of evolution, atheists have very strong questions. This is Stephen Fry, and he asked some questions during a TV debate called The Meaning of Life with Gay Byrne in 2015. And he was asked, what would you say to God if you actually met him personally, even though he didn't believe God exists? And this is what Stephen Fry would say to God if he met him. I would say bone cancer in children. What's that about? How dare you create a world in which there is so much misery that is not our fault? It's not right. It's utterly evil. Why should I respect a God who creates a world which is so full of injustice and pain? Well, of course, if there was no fall from grace, if evolution is true, then there is all this eons and millions of years of death, bloodshed, decay. Did God really say that that is all very good? Did God say that at the end of these millions of years of survival of the fittest, nature red in tooth and claw, that this is good? Because if you look in the fossil record, you can see things like bone cancer and brain tumors. You can find dinosaur bones with teeth marks in them. There's all this evidence of carnivory and suffering and death. And at the end of the day, a fossil is a dead thing. So do you put that before the fall? And if you do, then God is saying all of that is very good. God has become the author of natural evil. No wonder people like Stephen Fry hate God. But this is not the gospel. The gospel is very clear that God created everything perfect. God gave Adam and Eve free will, but they gave that up for their own will. And when they sinned and disobeyed against God, that was when death, sin, and suffering came into the world. So let's think a little bit about evolution and what it meant to Charles Darwin. He said this: natural selection acts only by taking advantage of slight successive variations. She can never take a great and sudden leap, but must advance by short and sure through slow steps. So this is the Darwinian evolutionary mechanism. And he said this in The Origin of Species back in 1859. So in a way, he gave a way to falsify his theory. Can evolution be tested? Darwin offered the possibility for his theory to be falsified. So if there is a mechanism, if there is something in biology that can be shown that it's impossible to arise by short and successive steps, each step being an advantage from the other, then he is basically saying his theory is going to break down. He also said this: natural selection acts only by taking advantage of slight successive variations. She can never take a great and sudden leap, but must advance by short and sure through slow steps. A sudden leap would basically mean a miracle. So evolution is working slowly over millions and millions of years by natural selection, by mutations, in theory, building up greater complexity. But is that the case? Let's find out. He also, there was a debate by a number of his followers here, and they said that evolution could never produce various mechanisms, such as the wheel and magnet, which would be fairly useless until perfect. That was by Davies and Haldane. They wrote that in 1949. They recognized the implications of evolution, that you couldn't have these mechanisms, a wheel or a magnet, that would have to be fully functional. But Darwin had no idea about what was in the cell at the time. They only had more primitive light microscopes. They could only see a cell with its nucleus. In fact, Ernst Haeckel imagined intermediates between cells, and he described them as very simple algemous blobs of carbonous reconstructions or something like that. But he imagined that these things were very simple. And Darwin had an idea that these cells were simple, the simple cell. But modern biology has actually told us something very different. Within the last 20 years, really, modern biology has come to grips with the staggering complexity inside the cells, inside all of our cells. You can imagine it like a miniature city full of bustling machines, micro machines scurrying around, doing complex tasks, processing of information inside our cells. And I'd like to show you a couple of videos of a couple of these various mechanisms. And these are not just complex mechanisms, they're what's called irreducibly complex. In other words, they have multiple parts that have to be playing together at the same time. There's no way you could actually step by step evolve a mechanism like these from simpler forms. Some of these machines literally have hundreds of different protein parts that are perfectly fit together, and they're all brought together by other machines. So let's try and play this. No. Any idea how I can play this? Can you actually play it from the screen?
You click from, I don't know whether the video would translate it up with the USB or not.
Right, okay. Sorry about this, we're having technical difficulties tonight.
If it's not working there, it probably won't.
Right, okay. Anyway, this is a picture of a micro miniature motor, and it's within all of our cells. And these motors, they rotate at something like 7,000 revs per minute. And these are the energy producers in our cells. We literally have trillions of them inside our cells. And they rotate really fast, and they take a sugar and add a phosphate and produce a type of sugar that our cells can use. And they have multiple different parts it's actually been described as the most miniature motor in the universe. And multiple parts, spinning, rotating, and if you can think, if you just took one of those parts away out of that motor, it would cease to function. So there's no way that you can actually evolve a motor like that step by step. And something as basic as this is required for life to exist. Without these miniature motors in all our cells, we wouldn't be talking to each other, basically. And also, there are other miniature motors. Unfortunately, I can't play this video. No, sorry about this. These would have been called kinesin, and the video I would have shown you would have been of this walking machine, and it basically walks along something called a microtubule in the cells. And each of your cells has about 1 trillion of these little walking machines, and they take big bundles of proteins that have been produced by the cell, and they take it to different parts of the cell at the right time, at the right place for the cell to be able to grow and reproduce. And there are other machines that actually pack the bag that it's carrying with all the right protein parts to be taken to the cell. And it's also like the postman. So the postman takes your letter to your address, and these kinesin motors, they walk around inside the cell, and they've already been told by the nucleus where to go. So there's an address on these kinesin motor that actually take all these protein parts to the right parts in the cell at the right time. And it's just dazzling complexity. And Darwin had no idea of this kind of complexity in the cell. And there's a chap called Paley who wrote just before the time of Darwin. And he said, imagine this, if you were walking through the woods and you looked down and you found a watch, and you would conclude that someone has actually lost this watch, but this watch had a history. It was actually designed by a watchmaker. Because we all recognize intelligent design, don't we? We recognize that the watch that we have on our wrist was designed for a function, a purpose, to tell the time. And when scientists look at these mechanisms, they recognize that they are produced for a purpose. They all carry out these functions. And just like the watch, with all its multiple parts, they have to be put at the right time together, else that watch wouldn't function. In fact, there's no way you could step by step evolve a watch by random. You have to have all the parts working together at the same time. And it's just like these molecular machines in your cells that scientists have been discovering for the last few years. They have to have all the parts together at the same time, else they wouldn't work. This is actually the death knell for evolutionary biology. But it's held at a philosophical level. And when we think of folks like, this is William Provine, evolution for him is a philosophical religion. And he wrote this: let me summarize my views on what modern evolutionary biology tells us, loud and clear. And I must say that these are basically Darwin's views. There are no gods, no purposeful forces of any kind, no life after death. When I die, I'm absolutely certain that I'm going to be completely dead. That's just all. That's going to be the end of me. There is no ultimate foundation for ethics, no ultimate meaning in life, and no free will for humans either. William Provine went to meet his maker in 2015, so I wonder if he's changed his mind now. So these are other evolutionary scientists, and they've made pronouncements on what is man. And this is what our kids are being taught in university. This is what the secular view is. This is Bertrand Russell. And he said this: "We are a curious accident in a backwater." Do you feel encouraged by that? This is Peter Atkins. He said, "Just a bit of slime on the planet." Anyone feeling slimy tonight? This is Stephen Jay Gould, Harvard professor. "A fortuitous cosmic afterthought, a tiny little twig on the enormously arborescent bush of life." And of course, we all know Richard Dawkins. "We live in a universe which has no design, no purpose, no evil and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference." You feeling encouraged tonight? Yes. Wonderful to be human, isn't it? So that's something to think about. But if you've rejected the gospel, if you've rejected God, this is your outlook on life. This is what your thinking is. It's very bleak. And when we teach the kids this, we have a problem. So teach children that there is no God, there are no absolutes, life is an accident, people are evolved animals, millions of years of violence, killing, death, disease, pain and suffering brought humans into existence. There's no God, the Bible is not true. Try removing the Bible, prayer and the 10 Commandments from school. Stand back and wait. And we can see the results of this often around the world and in our news. This is a particular example of a Finnish high school massacre in 2007. And he wrote this: "Life is just a coincidence. It's a result of a long process of evolution and many several factors, causes and effects. There are no universal laws than the laws of nature and the laws of physics. Evolution is both a theory and a fact. Creation is neither one. Human life is not sacred. Humans are just a species among other animals, and the world does not exist only for humans. Death is not a tragedy. It happens in nature all the time between all species. Not all human lives are important or worth saving. Sometimes I feel like no one is really worthy of life at all. I am prepared to fight and die for my cause. I, as a natural selector, will eliminate all who I see unfit, disgraces of the human race, and failures of natural selection." And on his T-shirt, he has "Humanity is overrated." Obviously, I'm not saying that evolutionists, people who believe in evolution, are actually going to go out and do this. But if you have a foundation where there is no ultimate meaning to life, if there's no ultimate meaning for ethics, why shouldn't you go out and be the natural selector? And in fact, this is exactly what Hitler did. He was a social Darwinist. If you ever read Mein Kampf or the history of Darwin, he put into practice natural selection into his entire economy. He was the natural selector. If we see ourselves as the most fittest in society, why not get rid of the unfit? So if you have questions about evolution and creation, then I suggest picking up a copy of the Answers book. And folks need to have the answers to why evolution doesn't work, why it is incompatible with science. You know, we are not at war with science. In fact, science is at war with evolution. It is an unscientific theory. It doesn't stand up. And in fact, the word says, "If my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge, because you've rejected knowledge, I will also reject you as my priests. Since you've forgotten the law of your God, I will also forget your children." Let's not be destroyed for lack of knowledge, folks. As a church, I'm really encouraged that you're having a meeting like this tonight so that you can get equipped, you can answer the kind of questions that you have, and that you can share these kind of questions with your friends, your neighbors, your colleagues, and be starting to answer the kind of questions that the world has. And these are the questions that folks have. You know, they will not believe in our God. They will not believe in the gospel. because of questions like evolution. You know, if God is a real God, then surely creation is true. And here's one question. What about fossils? Don't they prove the earth is ancient? Don't they prove evolution? Don't fossils take millions of years to form? Has anybody been taught that at school? I certainly have. Well, what is the evidence? Do fossils take millions of years to form? Well, this is a fossil fish, and he's been fossilized in the middle of his lunch. So obviously that fossil didn't take millions of years to form. And in fact, I would say that fossils have to be produced quickly. If any of you have ever kept a goldfish, do you know what happens when it dies? It floats. It doesn't sink. It actually floats. And I was taught that fossils, you know, they die and they sink to the bottom and they get slowly covered up over eons of time. But when you look at the evidence of the fossil record, you see things like this that are evidence of extremely fast deposition. Here's another one eating his lunch. Here's another example of ichthyosaurs, and they are preserved in the Jurassic rock in Germany. And if you can see coming out of the end here is a young ichthyosaurus. Now, obviously, that fossil didn't take millions and millions of years to form. I mean, I've heard of hard labor, but that would be ridiculous. So if we can just magnify upon that, there's a perfectly formed little ichthyosaur coming out. Now, this is consistent with the flood. You know, the flood would have produced catastrophic conditions that would have buried these animals very quickly in deep sediment without oxygen. And because of all the minerals mixed up in the water and in the sediment, the fossilization process could have started very quickly. What about millions of years of growth of things like stalactites and stalagmites? Have you ever gone to a cave and you've seen the formations of stalactites and stalagmites? I went to a cave in Italy, and there was this big column, and the guide said, "This is proof of 1,000,000 years of history." He based that idea off measuring drip of a stalactite in a very particular dry part of the cave. And you can measure the present rate of that formation, but that's all you're doing is measuring the present rate. But then to extrapolate that into the deep past, you're committing a great logical error because you're assuming that the rate has always been the same. And in fact, that cave guide wasn't there to see the formation of that cave in the beginning. In fact, we would say that that cave could have been produced catastrophically or could have been eroded at the end of the Ice Age. And something like that could be just a few thousand years ago. Unless you were actually there to see it formed yourself, you can't make definite judgments about how old it is. Here's an interesting example. This is the George Rogers Clark Memorial in the USA. It was built in the 1930s, I believe. And in the basement, the whole building is built out of the same rock that those caves are made out of, limestone. And in the basement, we have this formation. It's a stalactite, stalagmite that's actually formed within about 70 years. Now, clearly, that is not proof of millions and millions of years, is it? Because we have a historical record of how that was produced. It's not about time, it's about conditions. And when the conditions are right, you can have a lot of geological work being done. Here's another example. This is a bat that actually landed on a stalactite, and it was covered in limestone overnight. So clearly that bat wasn't going to be there for hundreds of years. This is another example in Hot Springs, Wyoming, and that formation was produced in about 100 years. So again, it's not about time, it's about conditions. So What are we teaching our young people? This is really important about how we are educating our young people. I'm sure there's a few Sunday school teachers here. If one of your youth group asked you, what about dinosaurs in the Bible? How would you respond? It's a question that you could well be asked. What are you going to tell them? Are you going to tell them the evolutionary line? Well, dinosaurs died out millions of years before man. They're a proof of evolution. Or are you going to try and put it in biblical perspective? So kids love dinosaurs. Did you know that recently in dinosaur bones, soft tissue has been discovered? This is from 1992, a paper that was peer-reviewed and published in Nature. And as you can see here, these are images from this paper in Nature, and they show material that could have been produced yesterday, fresh. And in fact, when she took this T-Rex tissue, she stretched it out under the microscope, and it stretched back into place. And since then, they've been able to sequence proteins and even see the evidence of DNA. Now, scientists know how long these biomolecules take to break down. And under best laboratory conditions, these kind of molecules can only last a few tenths of thousands of years at frozen temperatures. But out in the field, in real conditions, there's no way that these kind of soft tissues could last for more than a few thousand years. In fact, you can say that it's equivalent to the Egyptian mummies in the state of preservation of these T-Rex bones. And there have been many more examples of these kind of fossils that have been discovered with soft tissue. Now, this is all evidence that is consistent with a young Earth, and an Earth that is consistent with the biblical data of an Earth that is being created recently and that has been fallen because of sin, and that these bones would have been preserved in the flood. There's no way that these bones can be hundreds of millions of years old, because operational science tells us that these kind of molecules can only last for a few thousand years. So this is Mary Schweitzer in a 1997 NBC Live interview, and she said it's utterly shocking to her that these soft tissues could actually exist, that these proteins inside these soft tissues can be sequenced. It's shocking to her worldview that these bones are in millions and millions of years old. So this is still an ongoing thing. There have been many more examples discovered in paleontology, and there have been no reasons that have been published in the peer-reviewed literature to explain how these tissues could possibly last for millions of years. In fact, it's something that's not really discussed. They can discuss, what we can think about, how we can learn about the animal from the soft tissue and its life cycle, etc. But the elephant in the room, or the T-Rex in the room, if you like, is that, in fact, these bones are young. And if you have questions, we do something called a road show. And we can come with our dinosaur models, and we can have a whole meeting given over to dinosaurs. And the kids love it, and young people love it, and they come and find out about dinosaurs and facts and figures. And they can come and see how the evidence for dinosaurs fits the biblical history far better than the evolutionary history. And there's a church youth leader wrote into us, and he said that they started to lose their young people at the age of 16. And he realized that that was when they were actually taught evolution, and that they weren't getting the kind of answers that they needed from the church, probably because the pastor was actually saying, oh, it's okay, you can believe in evolution. And when the kids don't get their questions answered, they will lose their faith. He said, I used to beat my head against a wall, wondering why we lost all our young people at around age 16. I've realized that age 16 is when they teach evolution in depth in science. Some of the teachers actually identify the Christian students and make a special point of explaining the differences and difficulties in reconciling Genesis and the facts of evolution. It's no wonder we lost them. I came near tears just thinking about it. You know, I could show you statistic after statistic of young people leaving the church because the kind of questions that they have are not being answered by their leadership. You know, they're going out into universities and colleges. They're being taught evolutionary science as fact. Maybe in RE they're taught comparative religion and that the Bible is just the same as any other holy book. And when they're faced with these kind of intellectual problems and they don't have the intellectual rigor from their Christian peers and they can't answer their questions, then obviously they're going to say, well, if I can't intellectually defend my faith, then my faith is not worth defending. But we often have this picture of science as this monolith that is ultimate truth, don't we? We have the scientist there who's a pillar of objectivity and unbiased searching for truth. But at the end of the day, scientists are human. And in fact, they have a worldview that they bring to the table. You know, science has produced things like medicine and agriculture. We all benefit from technology. I'm using this laptop to bring my presentation to you. We've now got everything talking together over this marvelous, complex system. But science is wonderful. You know, it brings benefits to all our lives. But we have to recognize that there are different types of science. There's actually two types of science. There's operational science, which is repeatable and observable. As I've said, it brings medicine, technology, agriculture, etc. And science means truth, the search for truth. And the other type of science is historical science. So if anybody's watched CSI, that's a crime science program where they go out and solve a crime through their scientific method. This is a type of historical science. So other historical sciences like archaeology, sociology, anthropology, geology, all the ologies basically. And it requires someone to go out and reconstruct history because they weren't there to directly observe it. And so they can bring all their scientific method to bear. And as we can see, even though they have all the clues there, they might come to the wrong conclusion. Now, we all have a worldview, don't we? And this diagram actually shows how a worldview works. We can have the same data, we can have the same rocks and the same fossils, but if we have a different worldview, then we'll come to a completely different interpretation, even though we're looking at the same data. So it's not a fact that people who believe in evolution have more facts than Christians. No, we have the same facts. We have the same data. But it's how we interpret that data which is fundamental. And that worldview that we have is fundamental to how we understand history. So if you imagine this scene from CSI, the evidence is being shown to the jury, and the evidence points, DNA evidence proves that you were at the scene of the crime. And but we also have an eyewitness to say that you were at the scene of the crime 2 weeks later, after the crime was committed. Now, if that piece of evidence was not brought to court, you would be charged guilty, even because of the scientific evidence was saying that you were there. but the eyewitness is actually saying that you were there 2 weeks later. This is the power, I believe, in evolution, that only part of the evidence is often given at places like universities and colleges, and that if we would to have all of the evidence presented, then we would see that the biblical worldview is far more robust than the evolutionary worldview. And that's why we exist as a ministry, Creation Ministries International, is to get the kind of information out to folks like yourself, like dinosaur soft tissue, and like those examples of very rapid fossils that I showed. So it's never a case of faith versus science. That's often a popular view of looking at things. And there we have the poor Christian with his evidence, trying to struggle with the evidence, and the scientist there, objectified, he's without bias. But it's not a case of they have more facts. We have the same evidence. In fact, it's a faith of naturalism versus the faith of theism. It's a clash of worldviews. And when we can see it in those terms, then we can see that the answers that we have as Christians are far more powerful when we understand that it's a clash of worldviews. It's not about the evidence, it's about the interpretation of the evidence. And often evolutionists understand theology better than Christians. This is a classic quote from G. Richard Bozarth. And he said this, he wrote in the magazine, The Meaning of Evolution in the American Atheist. And he said, Christianity must be totally committed to the special creation as described in Genesis. And Christianity must fight with all its full might, fair or foul, against the theory of evolution. It becomes clear now that the whole justification of Jesus' life and death is predicated on the existence of Adam and the forbidden fruit he and Eve ate. Without the original sin, who needs to be redeemed? Without Adam's fall into a life of constant sin terminated by death, what purpose is there to Christianity? None. He said, Christianity must be totally committed to the special creation as described in Genesis, and Christianity must fight with its full might, fair or foul, against the theory of evolution. It becomes clear now that the whole justification of Jesus' life and death is predicated on the existence of Adam and the forbidden fruit he and Eve ate. Without the original sin, who needs to be redeemed? Without Adam's fall into a life of constant sin terminated by death, what purpose is there to Christianity? None. Now, there's an atheist who really understands the implications of the theory of evolution for the gospel and for the Bible. And I think many a Christian leader could do with reading that quote and understanding the power of it. Let's take this gospel verse. Romans 6:23 says, "For the wages of sin is death." Let's just think about that verse for a minute. If evolution is true, and we're all the product of millions of years of death and extinction, nature red in tooth and claw, that verse is wrong. The wages of sin is not death. Death was already in nature millions of years before Adam was ever around to sin. Now that verse is a central gospel text. And I hope you can see that trying to bring in evolution to the Christian faith is a central gospel issue. It says, "But the gift of God is eternal life through Jesus Christ, our Lord." Jesus Christ is our creator. He became our savior to save us from this fallen world and to redeem us to himself. Creation is no side issue. The Bible is clear. Death is an intrusion upon God's perfect creation, and the last enemy that will be destroyed is death. And this is why Jesus came to die. Adam and Eve and the original sin, Noah and the flood, were real and historic events. Are you a descendant of Adam today? I am. And because my great forefather died in rebellion, I have a problem. In fact, I submit to you, we all have a problem. And that's why our Creator stepped into history, took on human flesh, and died in our place for the sin of Adam, so that we could be restored to our Creator. Then you need redeeming by the second Adam. Jesus is the Redeemer who died for our sins. Evolution is false. Therefore, contrary to Richard Bozarth and atheists like him, Christianity is everything. So I would recommend, if you don't know the Creator who became your Savior, then you can come to know him as your Lord and Savior tonight. And we would be happy to help you further in this. And I would like to recommend to you our own Creation magazine. And in a minute, Dominic will hand out some clipboards to you. And I would just like to tell you all about Creation magazine. It's been going about 40 years. And it's written by our staff scientists from around the world. And it tackles head-on these kind of questions that people have and the latest pronouncements and news about evolution and creation. It's a quarterly magazine, a publication that answers the skeptical questions of our age in up-to-date articles written by experts in their field. And if you have colleagues, friends who ask these kind of questions, then you can give them a copy or tell them about the type of articles that are in there. This is a particular article that talks about crossbreeding between the cat kind. And did you know that lions can interbreed with tigers and produce something called ligers? And this is something that is incredible to think about. If these separate animals evolved for millions of years on different continents, but if they came off the ark a few thousand years ago, then why shouldn't they be able to interbreed? And in fact, there are lots of fascinating different examples of different cats that can breed and have offspring. This is another example of articles written by my colleague at the back there, Dominic. Has anybody ever been told that your appendix is a useless evolutionary after idea and you'd be better off without it? Well, in fact, modern science has discovered that it's absolutely essential to the growth and development of the infant, the fetus, and it's an integral part of your immune system, and that it's no longer thought of as an evolutionary afterthought. And possibly we get many people write into Creation saying that the magazine has helped them in their faith. This is Jeremy S. wrote, "Your writings played a big part in me becoming a Christian. My older brother got me a subscription to Creation magazine about 6 years ago." And there's another feedback writer says, "You guys make evangelism easy. I just give a Creation magazine to somebody, and then the next time I see them, we talk about it. Next time you go to the doctor's surgery, just leave one on the table." Kids love Creation magazine as well. This is Peter L., age 12, wrote in, "Your magazine is great. As soon as it comes through the door, the wrapper comes off, and I'm reading it. I wish it came more often. Keep up the good work." So if you'd like to sign up, then put your name down on the clipboard as it comes round. But we have a special offer tonight. If you sign up, you get a free goodie bag. So in your free goodie bag, you get a back issue, okay? You get a booklet, What on Earth is God Doing? So, Making Sense of Our Troubled World, a Biblical Christian Worldview. You also get a free DVD. Is Creation a Secondary Issue? This is featuring Dr. Martin Williams. Actually, it's all about Jesus. So that's a relevance talk similar to something that I gave. You also get a free timeline of biblical history. And last but not least, you get a free polythene bag to put it all in. There's no expense spared from CMI. So Dominic will hand out the clipboards now. And also, you can put it on up to 5 different devices. So you can have it on your laptop, your PC, your iPad, your phone. So you can have it on 5 different devices for your family. So, Q&A. We got time for questions? I hope you enjoyed that presentation. Hope it was useful for you. Thank you.
Come on, Steve, yeah.
Despite the technical
We've got about
gremlins.
15 minutes to about 10 past for questions. So Phil's sitting there with a mic, so he will pass it round if he works out how to turn it on, and we're done.
We have one rule. You can ask questions that I can answer. And if I can't answer them, I'll defer to Dominic. But feel free to ask anything not related to the talk or related to the talk.
So what about carbon dating? Mm-hmm. Is that fundamentally flawed? Because a lot of scientists say, well, this particular thing is millions of years old because of the carbon dating system.
You've actually put your thumb on a common misconception about carbon dating, that it's actually used for archaeological remains, because carbon dating is always used to date things that are only a few thousand years old. So the half-life of carbon-14 is something like 5,730 years. So it decomposes back into nitrogen very quickly. And it's been said that if the whole Earth was a lump of carbon-14, within 1 million years, it would have all degraded back into nitrogen. And so it means that on the planet Earth, there cannot be a molecule of carbon-14 any older than 1 million years. So when scientists do their tests to discover how old something could be, they use something called accelerator mass spectrometry. And it uses magnetic fields to bend the atoms of carbon-12 and carbon-14. And because they're different weights, they will be dispersed slightly differently. And so the method is very accurate to actually count the molecules of carbon-14. But it's been discovered for the last 20 years that all sorts of remains, rocks, minerals, fossils, have carbon-14 in them. So things like oil, gas, shale, dinosaur bones have carbon-14. And this has all been published in the peer-reviewed literature for the last 30 years. So there's literally hundreds and hundreds of examples of these supposedly million years fossils and rocks that have carbon-14 in them. And they shouldn't be. It should be something called carbon-14 dead. And recently, about 8 years ago, some creation scientists came together and they did their own experiments. And it's often been dismissed in the literature that's saying, this carbon-14 must be contamination. But they have their own methods to get rid of contamination. So if it's contamination, then the very method of carbon-14 itself is fundamentally flawed. But what they did was they took diamonds, which conventionally are aged, 1.5 billion years old, and were considered foundational to the Earth's formation. And they took these diamonds and they sent them off to carbon-14 labs. And these carbon-14 labs actually determined that there was carbon-14 in these diamonds. which would mean that these diamonds are just literally a few tens of thousands of years old. Whereas geologists would say, these were formed at the formation of the Earth. And it's impossible to contaminate diamonds. First of all, they've been deep in the Earth's mantle, and diamond is the most hardest structure known to man, so that carbon-14 and carbon-12 can't be exchanged inside the lattice of the diamond. So when we hear of reports of carbon-14 in things like dinosaur bones, diamonds, oil, coal, it means that all these things are young, and actually they were all produced at the same time during the flood. So carbon-14 is the creationist's best friend, actually. It's very powerful evidence for a young Earth. And if you go to creation.com and type in carbon-14 into the search bar, you can read all about this kind of evidence.
Can you talk a little bit more about creation in terms of the 6 days of creation and God resting at the end, and how you would talk to a youth group about something like that in a scientific way, in a way that they would understand in relation to their theory of evolution?
Well, I would say that simply outline to them that the Bible is talking about 6 literal historical days, and that's exactly how Jesus took it. That's how the New Testament writers understood it. That's how Moses understood it. And if you think about the covenant between God and Israel, Moses brought the 10 Commandments, and basically, there's the commandment there, thou shalt keep the Sabbath, because on it God rested on the 7th day. So right there is the idea of 6-day creation right there in the covenant with Israel. So it's fundamental to the Bible and Genesis. And to say that God is omnipotent, he can create anything he wants in any amount of time. And is what he said he did in Scripture. And if we have problems with 6-day creation because science basically says it can't happen, then why are we believing that Jesus rose from the dead? Because science tells us that dead men don't rise. Or science will tell us that you cannot turn wine from water or feed 5,000. All of the miracles are miraculous works of God, and because they're in history, we can't go back and actually observe them and repeat them and do scientific studies on them. But everything in creation is consistent with the biblical record, and when the evidences of science are looked at without the bias of evolution, they make far more sense in terms of what the Bible is saying about real history than evolutionary history. So, yeah.
So I have a question, like in Genesis chapter 10, and I've just wondered about this often. It says in verse 25, and unto Eber were born 2 sons. The name of one was Peleg, for in his day the earth was divided. Mm-hmm. I've often wondered, what does that even mean?
Well, the context is sort of around the time of Babel. And so we would say that was a linguistic division. And so Peleg would have been living at the time of Babel. When you look at the Genesis chronogenealogies in Genesis 5, you can actually see that Peleg was at the time of Babel. And so we would say that division is referring to the division of mankind on the face of the earth.
So it wasn't a physical division of the earth?
No. I mean, such a catastrophic thing would actually cause the flood. And in fact, we would say that the flood was caused by a division of the earth, a seismic event. Yep. There's a question here.
I just want to ask about what is your thought on global warming? Is it biblical? Is it found anywhere in the Bible?
I think a lot of our scientists working for CMI are quite skeptical. We don't have an official position on it because it's kind of a bit of a side issue for us. But we've done a couple of DVDs. We have a meteorologist, professional meteorologist that works for us, and we've had a PhD meteorologist, and they would basically say that there's little evidence to suggest that mankind has affected global warming, and that climate change has always happened. And that actually, when you take into account biblical history, climate has changed enormously since the flood. And if you look back in history, there was the Little Ice Age in Britain, and the Romans were picking grapes up in Scotland. And there's lots of evidence to suggest that, you know, climate is driven by something called the sun, which is the biggest energy source, millions and millions of times greater than man can output. So the sun's energy dips, and climate change dips accordingly, sunspots and things like that.
I want to say this with the utmost respect, but I find that your message is quite divisive, that it's us and them. And so my view on everything is that actually what science is doing is proving the Bible. That in Genesis you've got, right, there's light, there's water, there's plants, there's animals, there's man. And that's what science is proving. Now, the only bit we're not agreeing on is the time space of that. You know, was it 7 literal days, but what is a day to God? You know, is that a period of time? You know, Moses is the guy who wrote Genesis. Now, he's got it from from their ancestors and from their ancestors, from their ancestors. Now, if I was explaining a story to my son, I may use terminology that helps him understand. You know, a day could be a time period. Now, we're getting that at the word a day from the Hebrew as well. So we've got other people's kind of translations on that. But actually, I don't think it's as clear-cut as 7 days, all these guys are saying a load of nonsense.
Well, thanks for your question. I would put it back to what Jesus believed, and that he upheld the testimony of Moses, and that Jesus placed the creation of man at the very beginning of creation. When he had the debate with the scribes and the Pharisees, he defined marriage as man at the beginning. God made them male and female at the beginning of creation, not at the end of a billion-year process. And that, Jesus upheld, literal historical creation of over 6 days, God resting on the seventh. That's why we have the Sabbath, which is central to the law. But when you use the word science, I actually disagree with your definition of the word, because as part of my talk tried to demonstrate, there are 2 types of science. There's the operational science in the present, where you can measure, study, repeat. But things like historical science, in your belief in creation or evolution, that is a one-off historical event. No scientist was there to actually observe it. So to actually say that that is in the same realm as operational science, I think is a category error to make. These are based on worldviews of the investigator. And so God has given us a clear record in his word of what he did, plain and clear. This is the record that Jesus stood for. This is the record in Genesis. And CMI is not pitting science against faith. And that's one of my screenshots there. The idea that faith is against science, I actually dismissed that in one of my slides. And in fact, if you look at the history of science itself, all of the founders of science, to a man, were biblical creationists. They believed in a young earth, created over 6 days. They believed in a global flood. You can take that to the bank. You can look at science history, Steno, the founder of geology, all the founders of physics and chemistry, Boyle, Kepler, you name them. They were all men of their time, believers in the God of the Bible. So science is not against faith. But when you add philosophy to that science and make it try and extend beyond what science really is, to try and explain things like origins when the scientist wasn't there to directly observe and measure, that is extending science beyond what it really is. Because science, at the end of the day, is about repeating, observing, and measuring. So if you try and make up a story about a fossil, I mean, if you dig a fossil up, it doesn't have a label on it saying 150 million years and I evolved from something else. At the end of the day, a fossil is a dead thing and you don't know if it had any ancestors. So depending on your worldview is how you understand that. And my worldview is shaped by the Bible. And when Jesus spoke about creation, I believe as the Son of God, he is inerrant and that his Heavenly Father can't allow him to make error. And that as the Creator, he spoke truth. And so my whole worldview is framed by that. And so, you know, I've been saying in my entire presentation that there's nothing that contradicts science when you understand it from the biblical perspective.
Can I just follow on from what Sam has said, if that's all right? You've made a lot of convincing points for me tonight, and I am probably coming from a creationist perspective, so I'm not in disagreement with you. I think there's a couple of points I wouldn't mind taking issue with you on. I think Steve Chalk's not here to defend himself, and there's quite a lot that Steve Chalk has written about, particularly about the atonement, that I don't agree with. But I don't think he's a Christian brother, I don't think it's right for us to say he's rubbishing the Bible. He's just got a different interpretation of Scripture to what you have. So I think we just need to be careful when people disagree with our own view. They can still be Christians and fundamentally believe in evolution and yet still believe that Jesus is the Son of God who died for them and saved the whole world. So I think we just have to be quite careful in some of what we say, and I don't think we could accuse Steve Chalk of rubbishing the Bible. We could say we have a different interpretation of Scripture to what he would take. I think the other thing that it was interesting to the question behind me, you just said it's a sort of metaphor of understanding when you talked about Genesis 10. And I think it could be possible that the Adam and Eve story is a metaphor for us to understand something that is almost not understandable, how sin came into the world, the fall, what actually happened. It's a way of us understanding. You may take it as literal. I'm not quite so sure it's absolutely as literal as what you would take it. I just think we need to have just maybe a little bit more of a less definite understanding. But you obviously some people don't agree with me, but that would be where I take. But I do think we've got to take issue with respecting each other.
Well, thanks for your point. Did you want me to get back to that? Yeah. Well, I would just say that we understand something like the resurrection in all sorts of levels. We can understand it metaphorically and spiritually, but at the end of the day, it was a historic event. If it wasn't a historic event, then we couldn't build the theology that we understand that for our salvation is built on a historic event. And so the fall has to be built on a historic event.
Saved from what? There was no original. Adam and Eve they didn't sin. There was no sin, so Christ is there's no point in Christ coming at all.
No, I think that's right. I think we've got to have a way of understanding that sin entered the world.
God tell us the way. He has told us, and that is what he
Well, I think that is definitely a way of understanding it.
Not a way, the way. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I mean, you can't accuse God of messing it about.
Okay, let's not get into a...
Yes. Time for questions afterwards, yeah.
Yeah.
We have got another question, sorry.
It's a point really rather than a question, but it is, as Sam was saying, it's so essential that we get some really good ways of teaching creation and evolution to our children. And so one of the simplest forms or simplest things that I've said to the children is we talk about God being omnipotent, and we explain, he's all powerful, omnipresent and omniscient. And so I just explained that. He's all science, and that's how I put it to the children. And science is knowledge, and God's all-knowing. And yeah, just that's my simplest way of trying to bring that subject around. And then we go on to other ways of describing it. But I think it's important that we remember those fundamentals. And I think that's a good starting point for any conversation, peaceful conversation we'll have. But I would want to know, and I suppose I'd have to read all the back copies, all the magazines yet to come. What advice do you give to Christian RE teachers when they're landed with on the program that they have to teach evolution? How do they do it without being biased or sounding biased and get away with it?
I think we should teach kids evolution, but warts and all. The problem is that evolution isn't thoroughly taught. It's taught as a very cut and dried theory. They should be taught critical thinking. They should be taught how a model interprets data. They should be taught the difference between your interpretive framework and data, and how models can come to completely different results with the same data. And they should be taught the difference between natural selection and mutation, which are facts, but they have limits. And they haven't got the indefinite ability to produce new forms that Darwin imagined. And things like the complexities in the cell. Evolution works at a philosophical level because it simplifies everything. But biology is constantly seeing that the cell is unbelievably complex. Obviously we didn't see those videos tonight. But you would have seen these micro machines whirring into action, and these are staggeringly complex, produced by the cell, and evolution hasn't even an iota of an idea of how all this complexity came about. You cannot explain it in Darwinian terms. So the science is on the side of the Christian. This is the great thing. And this is why Creation Ministries International exists, is to equip people like teachers and to actually show them that science is on our side. Science operates in its natural place in the biblical worldview. That's where science came from the biblical worldview. It flourished, where in other cultures it was always stillborn. But in the biblical worldview, that's where you get science.
I think we've gone beyond 10 past, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. So back to the band.
the sound of revival. It's heaven roar and fire fall. Come shake the ground with the sound of revival. It's heaven roar and fire fall. Come shake the ground with the sound of revival. It's heaven roar and fire fall. Come shake the ground with the sound of revival. Our God's not dead, He's surely alive and He's living on the inside, roaring like a lion. Our God's not dead, He's surely alive and He's living on the inside, roaring like a lion. Our God's not dead, He's surely alive and He's living on the inside, roaring like a lion. Our God's not dead, He's surely alive and He's living on the inside, roaring like a lion. Roaring like a lion. He's surely alive. He's surely alive. He's surely alive. He's surely alive. Oh, He's surely alive. He's surely alive. He's surely alive. He's surely Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming tonight. This has obviously cost some money to put on, so it'd be really great if you contribute. We'll put some baskets round. Pass that round, and thanks. So we're going to pass a basket round. And thank you very much to our speaker. Thank you to our speaker.